Aha. I think I need to just change that to 2-channel CD quality. Okay, let's click. Now, the next question is have you got my voice at all? Has it returned to any kind of normality? I suppose it'll take a few seconds for Maggie to catch up on this because I'm running at approximately 15 seconds ahead of the rest of you. Okay, Rosie says, sounds like you're underwater. Oh no, Russ says, yay. Oh, I'm back. Woohoo! Oh dear, episode 46, and I'm still getting caught out by the technology. I have to remember that when Microsoft updates itself, it changes the wavelength or something, the megahertz of the microphones, and does a default, which for some reason puts my voice higher. This happened a few months ago. Okay, so where were we? Let's start all over again, and I'll cut all this lot out of the YouTube version before it goes up live. So, welcome once again. Welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 46. Mark 2. So, right, so tonight, yes, I'm going to be talking about the notion of diagonals in composition. So let's just throw that picture back up, flip that over, and the difference that it makes to composition in terms of adding energy, movement, drive to your pictures when you want it, and when more specifically you don't want it as well. Also, I'll be giving critique. There's 5 people have put in different pictures for critique this evening. So Asim took this photo while he was out in Gujarat. In fact, this is the unedited version. He did send me an edit, but then he wanted to know if there were other ways of editing it, because he's kind of wanting to get more into doing portraiture and capturing people when he can. Quinton sent in this picture of a dragonfly and is looking for some feedback about that. Roy sent in a couple of pictures, black and white photos that he's planning on submitting to competition. He was wanting to get some feedback and critique on them so he can tidy them up before he submits them. VG has been playing around with lens balls, glass balls, which kind of just, you can, as you can see here, you can have the background all beautifully out of focus, nice bokeh, but what's happening in the glass ball itself is in beautiful sharp focus. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then finally, Russ sent in a couple of photos, which he loves, generally gets really good feedback on, but in particular competition sites, they never seem to do quite as well as he expects them to. So he's looking for a bit of feedback on that as well. So that's what we're up against tonight. So here we are, live on Facebook. And I see comments have started already, which is great. So yeah, leave me comments. Let me know you're here. If this is your first time here, let me know where you're from as well. And if you find these podcasts particularly useful, you're finding them helpful, you would like to support them, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is the place to help. It's not compulsory, but it is always appreciated. Think of it as something like a bit like a tip jar, if you like. So let's see who's here. Let's see if I'm I'm not on my own. Fortunately, I don't think I've lost everybody in the process of trying to get rid of the high squeaky voice that started at the beginning there. In the false start. Okay, so Rosie is here. Rosie from Wigtown. Not Wigtown, Whithorn. Sorry, it's a little bit further south than Wigtown. Hi, Rosie. Stacey's here. Good afternoon, Kim and Maggie. Sunny day. The snow is melting in Pennsylvania. Brian from Dumfries is saying hi all. Russ is saying good evening. Ben, glad you could make it along, Ben. Well, glad all of you could make it along. This is Ben's first time here. We were chatting earlier this week and I invited him along, and glad you took me up on it. Diana from Wales is saying good evening. Sandra, hello everyone. I'm trying to access the live feed. Not sure why I'm seeing it at the moment. Okay, that was probably Right, we're now running 5 minutes behind. Russ is saying helium. That's to do with the squeaky voice I had in the false start. Stacey also thinking I was sucking helium too. Okay, so a few bits about how I sound. Russ says yay. I think that's when I've got my voice back again. Okay, various comments about the fact that I'm sounding fine again. Roy says yes. Quinton says hello all. Stacey saying much better. Jim says sounds okay, Kim. Right, and Mandy saying good evening, everyone. Janet Dawson, hello, joining for the first time. Thanks for introduction from Rosie. Welcome, Janet, and thank you for inviting me along, Rosie. And Becca says hello, bit late, sorry. Oh, you missed all the fun, Becca. Right, okay, so we've got introductions. So what I'm going to talk about first of all this evening then is the notion of diagonals. But having said that, first of all, it's about I think really you need to understand about not diagonals as such. So really what I'm going to, well, okay, let me just minimize that and then pull that up and right, okay, I'll close that window here. So let's flip over here for the moment. Blank sheet of paper. Gosh, was this really a good idea? Maybe I should have rehearsed this bit first. Generally speaking, there's quite a few photographers have heard of the notion of the rule of thirds. And the rule of thirds generally states that pictures, generally speaking, tend to look a bit better if your main subject is off-center. And actually, I'll tell you what, well, I'll not do the blank piece of paper just yet. Let me flip over here and see if I can find, let's open this one. So we'll take a picture like this dandelion here. And as you can see, basically all the focus is smack bang in the middle of the picture. Okay? And it's okay, fine, nice bit of bokeh. There's, what did I use? I'm using a 50mm lens, a 1.8 aperture setting, which means the background all beautifully softens out. So that's all very well and good. But the problem is in essence, the center of a picture is pretty much the dead zone. It's the place, it's the most boring place, it's the safest place. And to really understand the rule of thirds and then where we're going to go on to with diagonals, you have to kind of understand the notion of sort of dynamic tension. There's a point where in our evolutionary history, we learned to view the world by filtering out what isn't important and priming our brains for what is. And so if everything seems steady and safe, we tend to blank it out. If something's not quite right, we tune into it, we notice something. And by and large, that's because our ancestors that didn't notice something wasn't quite right tended to get eaten. Pounced on by the saber-toothed tiger, or our mammal little tiny shrew-like ancestors were eaten by other creatures, however far back you want to go down the evolutionary channel. Those that didn't notice if something was wrong or something was slightly out of kilter didn't survive very long. So we are the descendants of those who noticed something wasn't quite right. So we've got part of our brain is primed to not quite right. So if something's sitting in the middle, it's sort of almost perfect balance. And perfect balance is fine, it's pleasant, it's not jarring, it's not upsetting, but it's not particularly grabbing either. Whereas if I take this very same thing here and I move this down to a point whereby it's, let's say, like this. So now it's, the main part of it is a sort of, instead of being in the middle of the screen, is a sort of third of the way down from the top and a third of the way in. And it immediately makes it a slightly more interesting composition. In fact, actually, I'll just exaggerate that a little bit more by doing that. Now, it's not to say that this picture of a dandelion suddenly becomes an award-winning picture, but it has a slightly more interest than when it just sits smack bang in the middle. So that, in essence, is the idea of the rule of thirds. That if we go to here, if I shape up, if I divide this roughly 1/3 that way, and that way, making it into a noughts and crosses or tic-tac-toe for our North American cousins grid, then the main part of the picture is sitting on one of the corners, and you're looking at the corners of these inside square here. So that's essentially what the rule of thirds is that most of the time it sits better if it's off-center. And that can be that way. Likewise, we could have cropped it this way. We could have had if we'd done it in portrait mode as well. Again, not something like that. Again, not dead center, but 1/3 of the way down, 1/3 of the way across. It still has that. Oh, that wasn't quite what I meant to do. Undo that. Oh. That's what I meant to do. 1/3 of the way across, like that. So the main bit's happening here. So, but the thing is, the rule of thirds isn't really a rule. I hate the idea that it's called a rule. It's just everybody knows it as the rule of thirds, so you have to refer. But it's really a guideline. Most of the time, things tend to work better than that. However, once you understand that notion of rule of thirds, that's great, because suddenly your photography stops being dead center, you shift off center, and immediately you notice an improvement. In most cases. Now, there's plenty of times when that kind of off center doesn't work, or other compositional techniques work better. The biggest problem that you have with rule of thirds is that it encourages block thinking. So in essence, if we have a line here, and a line here, and a line here, and a line here, we're thinking in squares. Okay, these are slightly not squares because I've not used a straight line, but you know what I mean. That we're thinking in block, we're thinking across, we're thinking down, we're thinking verticals, we're thinking horizontals. And the problem with that is these are also safe and secure. They are less interesting. Whereas if you introduce the notion of a diagonal, diagonals have a different feeling to them. So let's flip over to blank piece of paper here. So if we think about it, a line going across is inherently stable. It's not going anywhere. If you see a pole or a tree or something, just a little ladder lying flat, it's pretty secure. It's not likely to be going anywhere. Similarly, if it's straight up, it feels relatively secure. Now, you might be able to push it over, but it doesn't really feel like it's going anywhere. We're perfectly used to seeing poles and trees and everything sitting upright, and that's fine. But if we see something at an angle, we're kind of waiting for it to fall over. It doesn't feel natural in it to just be suspended. And so consequently, because of life experiences and then evolutionary expectation, there's a sense that if something is at a diagonal, at an angle like that, that it's inherently unstable, and therefore, like off-center, becomes a point of tension, a point of, oh, something's not quite right, or a point of expectation, almost. Something might happen. And so what we tend to find is that a triangle feels inherently more tense than a square. A diagonal feels more tense than a horizontal or a vertical. A zigzag feels more tense than a curve. And so once you start to realize this, then it starts to change the way that you can create and compose your photos and what to start looking out for. That if you want to add a little bit of more movement or energy into a picture, you start looking for the diagonals. So if we go back to this dandelion here, instead of just, what actually happens then if we rotate it? If we now create a diagonal image, does that actually look slightly more interesting than if it's straight up? And then maybe if we start combining it with other things like rule of thirds or whatever, maybe it just starts to become just a little bit more interesting again. No. Okay. Should have sorted out that bit. But that diagonal is more interesting than the vertical. So another example. Let's take another example of where angles come in. If you think about the notion of vanishing points, we have a picture like this. Now this is very strongly dominated by the horizontal. The horizontal is, we've got the big patch of horizontal sky, a little bit of wiggle on the horizon. But the road, we know the road to be straight, but our perspective vision is creating this triangle. We then end up with these strong diagonals coming up the side here. Similarly, if we take something like this, an old railway station, which obviously isn't going anywhere, but though perspective lines that are moving us up start to take us into this idea of movement, of travel, of depth. And that really starts to make a difference. If we have this picture here, the diagonal is really stretching, very, very powerful diagonal that stretches from the top left down to the bottom right. And in fact, actually is sort of dragging our eye along the diagonal down to where the key action is actually happening. So this diagonal is acting like a leading line as well as creating that sense. Even though all these bikes are parked, none of them are moving anywhere, there's a sense of anticipation. There's a sense of movement, a sense of something happening in what is otherwise a very still image. There's even things like if you take a picture like this. Now, with this, we've got mountains in the distance and we've got this road disappearing off, and the diagonal of this road is now much stronger. We're not even looking straight up it, and it really is giving us, it's an empty road, there's nothing much happening there, but that sense of distance of driving off into the mountains, maybe enhanced slightly by some of these diagonals coming down from the sort of sunbeams through the clouds, the sort of triangly diagonals of the mountains, but the primary is this road, that's a really strong diagonal leading you into the picture. So there's that sense of movement. Even though nothing is happening, there's that anticipation of movement. Now, you can actually, if I cropped in, where is it? No, not that one. This is that same previous picture, but cropped in closer. But now, the road is only playing a part of it. Now what's happening is the diagonal of the mountains become really prominent. They're the main focus of the thing. And if they were straight mountains, if there was a straight edge, it would still be interesting. But I think it would have a different mood and feel to it. And this is really what it's about. It's about understanding. It's not to say that you always have to have the diagonal. You don't always need it. But it's to understand the impact and the change of mood that it actually has on your pictures. And once you really get to grasp the idea of diagonals, you can start using them to either up the tension and the power and energy of a photo, or to even calm it down. So let's give you a couple of other examples. Let's just close a few of those down for the moment. So some of you may, well, okay, and actually before I get onto that one, I did this shoot a few years ago, Nighttime shoot, single light source coming on to Jessica, who's throwing her hair backwards. And this is a fun, energetic image. You see the hair in mid-flight, and going off at a slight diagonal, we've got this fantastic shadow. And it's, you know, as photos go, I'm quite pleased with it. However, taken from a different angle, here, I know we did another shot, but I moved around. This then becomes far more powerful. There's far more energy in this one. So now we've got this sort of triple diagonal. We've got a really strong diagonal of the shadow. We've got the diagonal of Jessica with her hair flying out. We've also got the diagonal of the shadow of which was being formed because of the round spotlight that I was using. So we've kind of got this big, powerful zigzag moving through the picture. And it lends a lot more energy to it than this one. I mean, this has got some energy to it, but I would argue not as much energy to it. Other examples. Several years ago, I belonged to a band called Scruffy Buzzards. A lot of fun, and we created had our EP, and we were looking to create a cover image for it. And so at that point I was still fairly early on in my photography career, but we were going to do a sort of four blokes in front of a garage door, very indie band look. And this one isn't edited, but it gives you a sense of what we were starting out doing. So we've got decaying, rusty door, peeling paintwork. We've got four blokes in various degrees of looking moody. And there's me on the right with a bouzouki, which is kind of like a large mandolin. And although there are some diagonals in this, I'm holding the bouzouki off at an angle. Richie's got a slight diagonal here. John's got a slight diagonal with his bass. Mostly, the powerful lines are all in the verticals because of the garage door and the lines going up, and that we're all sort of pointing with our heads up. It's dominated by the verticals. However, if you really want to add tension into it, you need to have the diagonals. And this is the edited version. This was the picture we ended up doing. Now, it's of course, obviously fun with the idea that we're all beating each other up with the instruments. That is, of course, adding tension. You've only got to look at the serious gritted teeth and kind of feel and mood to it to know that we're doing that. But over and above the expressions is the sense that it's full of really strong diagonal lines. Most of them, the strongest ones are going from bottom left to top right, whether you've got the bouzouki and the guitar lining up with each other. We've got John's bass going up to this corner. We've got Bruce's drum also coming down like that. We've got legs, elbows, arms, all at different angles, and it drives home this, really ramps up that level of tension. And when I came to edit it, I put this sort of grungy texture over the top, but even the texture itself has diagonal scratches into it. And so when you put all these things together, you end up with this whole picture of, even though we are all posed for it, it's, get into place, stand still, set the timer, or have a friend press it, or whatever it is, we're standing still doing this. There's a real sense of energy to it, a real sense of ramping up that tension. So you can play with that kind of idea. Another version, other examples are, for those who've been watching for a while, periodically I refer to the sets of photos that I did for Fitcher McAndrew, a couple of potters I know locally. Now, here I want to sort of show you a couple of photos. So like this one here where Doug is at the wheel. So there's movement in the fact that he's squeezing the water out of the sponge because he's spinning he's got the wet clay. The water starts to build up on the inside, so he soaks it up and then pours it out. But what's creating the energy in this is the diagonal. We've got the pot going straight up, but his whole body is moving off to one side. His arm is coming up. It's tense, but it's this really strong diagonal, and with his head as well, which is echoing so it creates this strong line going up to that top right corner again. So there's a drive, real strong drive with that. And then if we move on to the next one, again, whilst again you have a strong upright with the pot, it's overpowered, it's more dominated by Doug's elbow really digging into the pot and his head turned over, to one side. So we've got these really powerful, so you just get that real sense of strength, of energy, of movement going on. Now, if we contrast these with the photos I was doing then of Hannah when she done her plates and then she was sort of applying relief to it. And here, unlike Doug's hard energy of making the pots, now we're into a very kind of meditative, slow paced decoration, which requires intense focus and meditation. Hannah here is squeezing the relief onto the plate. Everything is wet. And if she slips and messes up, trying to undo that at this point is going to be a nightmare, and you're pretty much going to have to wipe absolutely everything off and start all over again. So there's a slowness and a constant. So at this point, whilst there are small diagonals, like finger, what have you, the dominant lines are vertical and horizontal. Similarly, a close-up here of the relief being added. And here the dominant is the horizontal, is the plate. But if you look at that diagonal where the relief is coming out of the tube, that diagonal is what gives you that sense of movement. If that was straight up, you wouldn't really have a sense of much happening. It could just kind of feel like it was being held there. Here, with that angle, there's a sense of it moving across the plate. And so really, this is really what I wanted to try and get across to you, is to really, truly understand the power of the use of diagonals in your picture. If you want to add more tension, add more movement, add more energy, then you increase the amount of diagonals you've got. If you're looking to calm everything down, to create a more serene, meditative state, you increase the dominance of your horizontals and your verticals. So that's pretty much where I wanted to go. And to actually just one last bit then, well, a couple of last bits. First of all, in terms of the movement, here's a picture I did of Castle Douglas, my hometown, last week when we were getting some snow, and I just wanted no traffic on the road, so I just wanted to get that shot of just looking down the street. And whilst it's snowing but there's no traffic on there, you still have that sense of movement because you've got all these diagonals taking you into the perspective of the distance, and the tyre tracks in the snow are kind of helping to emphasise that as well. But the last thing I wanted to chat about with this bit was that first picture that I showed you of the man with the welding the chain. Now here's a shot from a different angle. So again, it's an unedited one, but what he's doing, these are trawler nets, basically, nets, but they're chains, go on trawlers, fishing boats, dredge up the fish and stuff and the shellfish at the bottom of the ocean. And so this guy's welding it. Now this photo here is very, very dominated by the horizontals and the verticals. Whilst there's the odd bit of diagonal here and there, this really strong line running in the background, very powerful horizontal. We've got the horizontal of the table, we've got the verticalness of the legs. There's not enough distance for that real perspective thing happening, so even the chains in the foreground just feel very square. So everything's kind of feeling square and solid, and you're just watching somebody going away at it. But if we then move to this one, and all I've done is move around 45 degrees, now there's barely a horizontal or vertical line to be found. I mean, you can find one here, but even the horizontals here are slightly off. The verticals of the structure of the building because it's a wide angle lens I'm using, are all tilting out. I'm deliberately using a wide angle lens and then kind of getting in close to this table to absolutely emphasize these diagonals. By photographing from the corner of the table rather than a side, all these lines are sort of shooting off. And then even his stance seems much more coming over and into it. So the difference in power between that, and it's not just to do with how I've edited it, it's all to do with the composition. It's the angle at which it's taken. So that's really what I wanted to talk about. I really wanted to just get across that idea that understand diagonals and look out for them in your composition. If you're wanting to ramp up the energy of your pictures, think, how can I move the camera? What angles do I need to change in order to start making these lines appear, coming in at the diagonals rather than everything being neat and tidy and in sort of block form. So, hope you found that interesting. Those who've been watching this forever will know that I talked about this way back around sort of episodes 3 or 4 or something like that. But it crossed my mind that an awful lot of the people now watching these podcasts weren't around at the very early episodes. So I thought it's probably worth reiterating some of these things. Some people have heard it before, always kind of like to hear it again. And then last week, Sandra left a message in the comment on the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres Facebook page, saying I was talking a lot about angles and diagonals and could I explain a little bit more. So it just seemed like a kind of good idea to sort of pull this together. So I hope you found that interesting. Okay, I'm going to flip back over to the comments now and see if anybody has left anything. What have we got? Okay, so little bits of comments from Becca and various people saying missing the technical hitch. The technical hitch being that my voice was all high and squeaky when we started because of a Microsoft update that changed the settings on my microphone, which I didn't realise until I'd already started the podcast. Nuria's come in. Sorry she's late. Where are we? Rosie says, "Oh, must look out my video of the Scruffy Butters at the Masonic in Coubry." Ah, gosh, that was, in fact, actually, I think that was our very first ever gig, but we are going back quite a few years, possibly about a decade now, I think. So, what else have we got? So Stacey, interesting, finding it educational. And Sandra says, I found the demo with the dandelion really helpful, as you could see the impact the alterations made because you had the before and after session. It gives me some ideas to try out when I'm out and about taking photos. Russ says, I also like the slight diagonals of the snow in your street scene, subtle but effective. Yeah, it's back to that notion of it's the perspective. It's the perspective lines just all kind of start drawing you down. And that notion of perspective, we know there's a road to travel. We know there's distance. And so there's automatically a sense of movement or anticipation of movement. And once you start pulling in that notion of anticipation, excuse me, then that has automatically added more to the photo than is actually there. If you just look at, it's like, if you look at a picture of a chocolate bar, it's a picture of a chocolate bar. If you look at a picture of a chocolate bar and you're thinking about eating it, or the wrapper is being taken off, or you see it, somebody going about to take a bite out of it, you've now added layers of anticipation into it. And so the viewer now has a different relationship with it, with that picture. It's not just an objective copy of what happens to be there. And I think that's really kind of at the heart of trying to generate photography which is more than just a snapshot. If you like, the difference between a sort of snapshot and a photo that I think is engaging is a snapshot tells you everything you need to know in an instant. Here's a picture of my lunch. Maybe that's all we need to know. Here's an interesting picture of my lunch has to make me want to look at the photo for longer. And that's not necessarily about the ingredients, but how these things are laid out on within the shape of the picture. So that's what composition is all about, and that's why understanding how powerful diagonals can be one of the most useful tools you have in your toolbox, I think, for transforming your photos. Long before you ever get round to light or worrying about whether you need a bigger camera or a bigger lens or anything like that, I think if you can understand diagonals, then your photos will lift up a level, and you're immediately going to start sort of seeing the improvement in what you're able to achieve. Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do now then is move on to the second part of tonight's program, which is the critique section. So what happens here is I have a Facebook group, Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. So just go to Facebook, type in Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, you can find it. And basically this is the place where people can stick their photos in for critique. The problem we all have with our photography is we're too close to it. When we take a photo, we are emotionally attached to it. We remember all the sights, the sounds, the smells, the taste, the feelings, the mood that we were in when we took that photo. When somebody else looks at that photo, they have none of that. They only have the visual bit that we present to them. So it makes trying to judge our own photos and how effective they are particularly difficult. Trying to get feedback is very difficult because most people don't know how to give feedback. Most people are not photographers. And most people are being nice. So when we stick our photo onto Facebook and say, hey, here's my picture, all these people click like or love or whatever and tell us how wonderful we are, which is great for the ego, but doesn't necessarily help us advance our photography, because if there's something wrong with it, either they don't know, they don't care, or they didn't really want to upset you, so didn't want to draw your attention to it. So the whole point of creating this corner of the internet was to give people a place to get genuine, proper, constructive feedback on their photos. So if this is something you would like to take part in, stick your photos into the group, and the following podcast I'll take a look at them and try and give you some feedback. If you find this particularly useful or interesting, do consider buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres. Right, okay. So what we've got is 5 people have sent in 7 photos this evening. So let's start our way through it. Okay, so first up, what am I going to talk about? Okay, I need to move up here, and I think we'll start with VG tonight. So I haven't actually seen VG writing in the comments yet. Either this isn't showing me all the comments, or VG's not managed to make it along tonight, or has fallen asleep, because it is 1 o'clock in India, it has to be said. Actually about 1:30, quarter to 2 now, I think. It's 5.5 hours ahead of the UK. But however, I know she will catch up. So what VG did was she sent in, this is her unedited version. And she said, sunrise at the Marina Beach close to my home. The silhouettes are my brother Sridi's. The crystal lens ball is a new addition and I wanted to try them. It's tricky as it rolls easily, and I did not have a transparent stand to hold it in place and didn't want scratches on it either. Hence it needed a stand to put it in. There are 2 images, the one I'd edited, and I changed the tone to give it a bluish tint. Now, have we got, yeah, there we go. So cropped in a bit and given a bluish tint. In reality, it looked more golden and orange, thanks to my brother who took the walk with me. Now for the critique section, which is looking for any inputs on how to take better photos with the crystal ball lens, a welcome from me and the community. Now at this point I will say she put it in yesterday or the day before. Nuria wonderfully put in into the comments a couple of photos that she's taken using these kind of lens balls, and then between her and Jackie as well, conversation started up about tips and tricks of how to use these. So if you want to find out a little bit more, you want to explore this a little bit more, again, go to the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres Facebook group and you can follow some of the chat there. Basically, the whole way this works, this lens ball means that you've got a ball of glass and it acts like a lens, and that if you place it somewhere and you point your camera at it, whatever happens to be on the other side of it is going to be in focus. So that means you can do a really wide aperture, create a narrow depth of field, which gives you a really blurred background, but still have something very much in focus in the ball. The main thing to remember about it, though, is that the ball inverts the image. So as we can see here, here is VG's brother Srini, and but he's upside down. We've got the sunrise upside down. So she goes on. VG says, "I've ordered a tiny glass holder that will be less intrusive." Now, the cool blue tinge you do in your photos, I tried to bring it on, but it was a bit of a disaster, hence the changed tone. Please, if you have time, can you show me how to edit that effect? So what I'm going to do here is, let's open this in Photoshop. And we've got the picture here. Now, it's very orangey red, but if you want to kind of, in a way, make the most of that red, you kind of want to have a contrasting colour. So a little bit more blue in it could make it really interesting. Now, if I'll just duplicate that layer, I'll just quickly go into Camera Raw, which allows me to very quickly do a white balance shift. So if I take the white balance and I move it to the left, it becomes much bluer, much cooler. And now we've got some beautiful tones in the sky of this. However, we have lost some of the rich warmth that was actually in the original. Now, one way you could do this is you could mask this off and then paint in back just over the ball itself. And then that way you maybe get the blues within it and you keep the reds behind. And then maybe you could even take this smaller and then just darken back in around the sun itself. So you kind of keep some of the reds there. Now that's looking very rough, not quite as good as I would really like it. There is another option, which I sometimes play with, where what you do is you go to Channel Mixer. Channel Mixer is always a little bit of fun. The default here is you go to the red channel, the red's sitting at 100, the green and the blue are sitting at 0. And then what you do is you put the green at 100 and you put the blue at -100. Now, what that's done is it ramps up the greens and the blues, except for, the reds and the blues, and kind of gets rid of any green tints, except for the fact that it's still lacking a bit here. However, if we go back to, let's just disable that mask for a moment, this blue version here, and then we stick this over, we can see it's now gone hyper blue because this was too blue to begin with. So what we do is we can take this and we can change the opacity. So we go from the how much red do we want, how much blue do we want, and then somewhere, kicking probably around the middle-ish, something like that, we end up so we've got a beautiful bit of blue in the sky here, we've still got a deep red from the glow here, we've still got red in the sky, and that kind of creates an interesting, so if I just group those together, and you can see the colour's gone from that to that, it stops it being quite as dull, so it richens up those colours. And then if we go back to the crop, and what she'd done was, again, that kind of rough rule of thirds kind of thing. Now, that I think then becomes a sort of slightly more, you've got interesting colours here. There is if you're wanting to play, but one of the things about the lens ball is, of course, it has turned the image upside down. So it then becomes slightly interesting if we do, let's flip the image horizontal, flip it vertical. And now it's almost like, I mean, that piece of wood could be almost like a light bulb kind of coming down from the ceiling. Because we can't see the background, we don't know which way round it is. But now this part of it becomes very much, it's the right way up. And we can, zoom in and see the person and the beautiful sunrise on the beach at the same time. So that's one way of playing with it. I've also seen other versions where it becomes really interesting, where you put the ball on a reflective surface. So you have it on a glass table, or even in a little pool of water. I saw one earlier today when I was just sort of doing a quick Google search on lens balls, where it was down at the beach in a little rock pool. Or in a sort of wet bit of sand where the tide had come in, or sort of water had come in and then just gone out, or a wave had come in and gone out. And then the ball was placed on the wet sand. The sand itself was wet, so it was creating a beautiful reflection. So the reflection itself was the right way up because it was upside down from the upside down ball. So like a kind of double negative makes a positive. So that's really what I wanted to show you with that. So hopefully that starts giving you some ideas. It's a fun thing to play with. I don't think these things are massively expensive. I meant to check and I forgot, but I think somewhere around £30 or £40, might be less, might be more, and translate that into, well, basically just Google it, you'll find out. I think they can be quite a fun. You kind of have to be slightly careful. I think they can be a little bit gimmicky, and when you start overusing them. Like any kind of little novelty thing, to begin with, you're just going to use it all the time. And that's great because you're learning while you're doing it. Eventually, you'll get to a point where you go, right, okay, now I know how to use it. I will restrict it to the times when I think it's really adding an impact to it. But yeah, hopefully then, VG, that's giving you a few ideas for that. So let's flick back to the comments, and what have we got here? Okay, so Becca says, great lens ball shot, VG. Stacey says, I've been experimenting with a lens ball. My friend got me one last year on my birthday, and Stacey also likes the shot. Becca says, I'd have got a bit lower to include the sunset in the background. Yeah, so if you had actually got the sunset out of focus slightly off to one side of so it was in the picture as well as inside the ball, that could have been really interesting. That's a nice idea, Becca. Rosie says she tends to flip her lens ball shot, so she's much more likely to turn it upside down so the background is upside down. But if it's out of focus, you're not really going to notice that so much. And Russ says the inverted edit looks really interesting. Stacey says, I tried using aluminium wrap bunched up to make it reflective. Okay, that sounds like an interesting kind of surface. Nuria says £13 to £15, including delivery. Depends what size. Okay, so that's not a lot. And Stacey says Amazon mine was around $19. So yeah, that's same kind of a rat. So £13 to £15, $19, $20. Indian rupees, that's going to be what, 130? Or is it 1,300? Can't remember now. 100 rupees to the pound, I think, ish. And Becca says, I got conned then, paid £30 for mine, haha. Right. But maybe you bought it from a more reputable place, Becca. Okay, so we'll not get into too much of the politics of it. Right, okay, that was really interesting. So thanks, VG, thanks for sending that one in, and thanks to everybody else for your comments and input on that. So next up then, Quinton did a photo of a dragonfly. So let me just pull that up. And Quinton says, the colours were what caught my attention. It rained the whole night and it was very wet at sunrise. Cloudy but no rain. I was sitting on the deck of the pier into the lake, and I took the opportunity to take the images. Only after some processing on the computer, I also saw water droplets on the wings, which you can sort of see here, which add a nice little bit of extra texture to it. Of course, you can see the lovely water droplets on the wood here as well. So beautiful texture. And he says, I tried to use the diagonal lines or angles in this composition using the wood of the decking. He's using a Canon 90D, the 50mm 1.8 lens. So that's the little nifty 50, as known as. It's a little prime 50mm lens, which you can get for Canons and Nikons. It's one of the cheapest lenses you can get, about £100, $130, $140, something like that, US. And so it was a shutter speed 160th of a second, aperture f4. Maybe you can advise me on the settings and what settings you would recommend. So really what's happened here is you've got your camera on you, you see the dragonfly, opportunist, you take the photo of it. And to be able to take it before it realises what's going on and flies off is brilliant. You know, anyone who's got a camera would just, you know, try and do exactly the same thing. The fact that you've got the decking at an angle, actually, I think, similarly to what we've just been talking about with the diagonals, adds a little bit more movement and tension to it. We've got a strong diagonal coming up from the tail of the dragonfly, we've got the wings coming out at diagonals, but you've got these really strong diagonals coming across from the gaps in the decking. The f4 as created, we can see here that it's in focus on the head of the dragonfly here. And if we want to know where the depth is, we can see it happening through the droplets of water here. That out of focus here, and then just about here it comes into focus. And we can see this line running across here, which is where we've got our focal point. Now, settings then come down to how much more of it did you want to have in focus. If you wanted to have, you know, so the back of the tail, the top of this wing, the back of this wing, they're all sort of drifting out of focus. If you wanted more of them in focus, you would have needed a narrow aperture. So instead of an f4, if you've gone for an f8, an f11, something like that, you would have had more of the dragonfly in focus, if that's what you wanted. To compensate with that, though, you would have had to have gone for a slower shutter speed to let more light in, or up to your ISO, which would have made it more noisy. So there's always that kind of balance whereby you're trying to get the right kind of, you know, to get the settings you want, you're quite often compensating against something else, and that then becomes a decision you make through practice as to whether you feel it's okay about the noise or whether you feel it's okay about the depth of focus you want. I think the other thing with this, and it's a tricky one, is really the idea of, I think you kind of want to get lower. I don't know how possible that was. If this was actually literally at ground level and you've got the camera on the ground, you're not going to be able to get much lower. If it's on something like a table and you can get right down to, then I think there's a real thing when you're photographing wildlife. Similarly, when you're photographing children, and in some ways there's an awful lot of similarity, the best thing to do is try and get to their level. You know, if you photograph a squirrel but you're looking down at it, it's never going to be as interesting as if you're looking kind of at eye level with the squirrel. Likewise, if you're doing pets, if you get down to the level of the dog or the cat or the goldfish or the snake or whatever happens, you know, whatever kind of pet you happen to have. Children, you get down to the level of the child. The closer you can get, the more intimate it feels. You then feel less like, well, the everyday. The everyday is we're taller than the child, we're taller than we tend to look down at the dog, the child, the dragonfly. So that's ordinary. Part of the fun of photography is trying to find the bits that, whilst they might be ordinary, no longer appear ordinary because of the way we have framed it in the camera. And one of the best ways of doing that is to try and get down as best as you can towards eye level with the insect. And, you know, in the case of the dragonfly, if you can get down at that level, the more of it you are, I think, the more interesting it becomes. So hope that helps a bit. Little thoughts there. Right. Okay, so Rosie says, lovely dragonfly. Oh, VG is here. Good evening, friends. Slept off and missed most of the session, I guess. So, yes, Russ is just reminding VG, or letting VG know she's missed her critique bit, and VG's, we'll watch it again after the session. Okay. Yes, I deliberately did yours first, VG, because I thought, you know, in case it's going to be late, so you can get to bed early. Right, okay. So, and VG likes as just commented about liking the dragonfly. So, right, okay. Next thing that we're going to look at then is Roy. So, Roy says, I took some black and white shots at the campus of Huddersfield University. I'm thinking of entering these in the monochrome round of the Amateur Photographer of the Year 2021. So I said, well, what kind of feedback are you looking for? And he said, oh, just the usual stuff like wonderful, incredible, etc. Which actually I suspect is what most of us want. You put your photos in, you say it's in for critique, but really you just want me to tell you how brilliant you are, rather than actually what's wrong with the photo. You're human, of course we all want that. However, much though we want that, we're here to learn. So, okay, so he goes on, no, seriously, I got my DSLR for Christmas and I'm still learning, so any constructive critique on how I could have improved them is welcome. So let me show you the, oh, right, I see Quinton's just said thanks, Kim, for the critique. Well, I'm okay, thanks, Quinton, I'm glad you found it useful. Right, so let's find those photos of Roy's. So these are photos for a black and white competition. So we've got this one and this one. Now, oh, and he also actually sent me a picture of this, which is the building which he's taken from. So you can actually see here, this, if you look at this pattern on the side of the wall here, that's the pattern that's there. And if you look at these patterns across the windows, that's what Roy has caught here. So, first of all, Roy, I would say I think you're really onto something by the idea. One of the great advantages of black and white is it removes the distraction of colour and allows you to concentrate either on tone or on line and form. And that's what you're doing with these. These have become essentially abstract photos that are all about texture, line, form. They're also both strongly using diagonals, which is of course what we've just been talking about. So you've got these photos, you're pleased with them. You're going to put them into the Amateur Photographer of the Year competition, which I think is the one you're referring to is on PhotoCrowd. But want to sort of see if there's anything you could, tweak with them before you do. So I think what I'll do, I'll start with this one. Let's open it with Photoshop. And okay, we'll just close the one with VG. Now, first thing I would say is, if you're doing black and white, unless there's a compelling reason not to, use the full range of black and white. Try and take it up to, you don't want to blow out the highlights and you don't want to have stuff too lost in the shadows, unless that's the stylistic thing you're going for. But you do want to get things as close to the edge, as near to white as you can and as near to black as you can, I think, for when you are playing around with shapes like this. So, whereas this kind of goes up to a mid-grey. So quite simply, if I take the levels, we can see down in the bottom right hand corner on the histogram, there's a great big gap over on the right here. And I think if you drag that up to either the edge of where it starts to rise up or just a fraction before it, now we see it's a brighter picture. And that now it's already up here on the left. I mean, if I drag this down, I think that just makes it too dark. So you're probably fine on the left of the histogram, but you want to drag the levels up a bit. And I think immediately that's giving us a little bit more oomph with the picture. So do make sure you kind of, where possible or where you think it's necessary, there is a range of tones within this, so you kind of want to make the most of that. Now, the next thing I would say with this is, whilst diagonals are, there's diagonals all over the place with this, what I feel is that you kind of need to hook them. You still need something. You need something like one strong vertical or one strong horizontal in which to anchor the rest of them. And it feels like there isn't quite. And so if I just, all I'll do is if I take this and now we could either try and anchor it to something like you've got a fairly strong vertical line here in the middle. Not sure that maybe works. Or what we could try is anchoring to a kind of horizontal. You've got these horizontal lines running across the building here. And there I think maybe need to tweak it just a little bit more. I think the other problem here is the fact that because of the angle of it, none of these are going to line up completely because the bit on the right is further away than the bit on the left, so you've got a little bit of perspective distortion. So I'll tell you what I will do here. Let's just to kind of show you, if I just take this, and what we'll do is if we just stretch out those little corners a little bit, just to make sure those parallels are a little bit more parallel. Those horizontals were a little bit more parallel. And now I think if you've got something like that, because you've got the horizontals then become an anchor, and it allows those diagonals, the ones that both go to the left and to the right, to then really do that stuff without it kind of feeling necessarily that it's kind of going all over the place. So you've still got that abstract sense. But if we compare it, say, to that, I mean, I quite like the fact that there's more of it in there. So really, it's this is maybe cropped in a little bit too close. But I suppose in terms of taking the photo, if you were further back, I mean, one of the things I say quite often, I think this is one of your first times here, Roy, so it bears repeating, is generally speaking with your photo, unless you really have exactly what you want in camera, exactly as you want it, err on the side of caution and always take a slightly bigger photo from further back than you might need, and then that gives you cropping options. It gives you the chance to tilt it a little bit, it gives you a chance to crop in a little bit without losing the main bit of what you wanted. Now, over time, you might get to a point whereby you see everything exactly as you want in camera, but if you're at all uncertain, give yourself a little bit more space so you've got room to maneuver in the editing, and I think you'll find that particularly useful. So I think with this, if we go to that point of you either want to find a strong vertical or a strong horizontal to anchor the picture, and then that really allows all the rest of these diagonals to do their thing in what is a really nice kind of abstract piece. But then the other thing is there, Roy, is to make sure that you've got that levels thing going on. So that was picture one. Quick flick over to the comments. VG loves the building. Becca loves the shapes. Stacey says, love the shapes and the nice shadows and reflections. And Stacey likes the advice to say, give it air or space. Okay, so the next picture then, which was, no, not that one, was this one. Now, I think, again, what we've got is, because the black and white is working well, what you're doing is you're just concentrating on the notion of shape. Getting rid of the notion, we don't necessarily know that, I mean, we don't know that that's printed on the side of the building. It could be shadows from something that's just sitting slightly out of sight. Now, I think if you then think about what I've talked about in the last one, we're going to start to see some of the sort of slightly similar things happening here, which is you've got a nice strong vertical over on the right here, but because of the way the angle is, or the lens, or whichever it was, this is sort of feeling tilted over to the left, and it kind of, not in a kind of a strong diagonal line like these grey lines behind, but it's just a slightly off, which actually looks like it's about to fall over. This bit in the middle, similarly, is just slightly off. The further over we go, the more these are leaning over. And because what you've got is you've got two virtually identical, we've got this bit on the, these poles here with the lights or attachments, whatever they are virtually identical. You're expecting them to be close, to sort of mirror each other, and they're not. And I think that kind of just it's not creating the tension as in, ooh, that's a bit more interesting, let me linger along. It's just kind of making you feel a little bit uncomfortable. A bit like when you sort of see somebody and they've got a horizon line which isn't quite off. If you have a strong diagonal like in Quinton's Dragonfly, you know those lines are supposed to be diagonal. Alternatively, he could have had them where he had them horizontal. If he'd had them sort of 2 degrees, it would have felt really wrong. You've either got to make the statement with the diagonal or you make the statement with the horizontal or vertical. And I think this sort of slightly falling over is playing against you with this. Now, again, the real answer to this is to go back and retake the photo with these things in mind. But what I tend to feel as well is that while you have anchored this to the right, because of all what's going on, all the busyness that's happening over on the left. Actually, I'll tell you, if I just can I zoom that out a little bit, just so I'm aware that this interesting bit here is getting hidden behind my little bit on the bottom left corner. But you can see that's where all the interesting stuff is happening with the pattern. I think if you got that bit straighter, then I think that would have sort of made a little bit more difference. So now there's a couple of different ways we can do this. So again, if I grab this, I could pull this over like that and sort of straighten it up. And that works a little bit. I kind of then don't really like the evenness of these things here. But we're also, because I'm pulling this picture out here, we're losing some of that lovely design there. The other way is to actually pull it from the other side. Sorry, gone back too far. And what I'm going to do here is where do we go? Yeah, I want that strong line there. And so by kind of trying to get this one straight, really. Now it's kind of going all over the place. It doesn't really matter. But the point that I'm trying to make really is that I think it works better if you've got the straight pole on the left to kind of anchor it a bit. This bit then over here could be, either cropped out or removed, or not quite sure what's happening there. Just, yeah, okay. Anyway, you get the idea. Whether you then need to have this straight or whatever is, maybe that one, you could even have that bent over a little bit further. I'm not sure. I think it works better when you don't actually have the 3 of them together. And I think it works better when you've got, if you're going to anchor the vertical, then you actually anchor it on the left here. But I think really part of it is you've got this really interesting pattern over on the left here. And I think you could kind of make a little bit more of that. If you nudged the photo over a little bit more. If I just, actually, where was, you showed me what the original. So here's the original photo, and we can see that that's where the pattern is. And here, obviously, that's where we can see where the lights are. These lights here, okay, I'm not totally sure quite the angle you were standing at to get the bits you did, but that's a kind of fun pattern. So yeah, I think there's places to play. I would say if it's just down the road from you, go back there and try again from different angles. But hopefully that gives you a couple of ideas. And again, maybe if let's just double check the levels on this. Again, you're quite dark here, and I think you could pull that up, just that fraction. It doesn't have to be totally white, but almost white. Allow, if you're working in black and white, unless there's a compelling reason not to, your default tends to be try and use as much of the dynamic range as you can. And I think it was particularly noticeable in this one. It sort of brightens it up and gives it more oomph, a bit more punch. So hopefully that will give you some ideas then, Roy, to either polish up or play around or revisit the place, and make them to really, you know, get the best version of that photo that you can. Cool. Right. Oh, long one. Where are we? So, what else have we got here? Russ says, makes me think of guitar strings and frets. Yeah. I'd clone or crop out the dark block in the bottom right corner, which I find quite distracting. Yeah, I think there was something else going on in the bottom corner as well. And Nuria says, if you've got more time, go back and take a few more shots. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let me just double check what you said there, Roy, which was some shots taken on campus at Huddersfield University today. Now, okay, I don't know whether you were just happening to be visiting it because you were dropping somebody off there, or whether it's just down the road from you. But if it is close by, I think it's well worth a revisit. Cool. Okay. Oh, Roy says, thanks for the advice, Kim. Definitely worth a coffee. Oh, well, thank you very much. Cool. Okay. So, next up then is Asim. So, where's Asim's photo? So Asim sent me this photo, and then that's, sorry, no, not that. Where have we gone? Why is he? And that's the edited version. Sorry, that's the unedited version, and that's his edited version. And Asim says, "Hi Kim, I took this one sometime back in Gujarat, in northern India. It was taken on an old Nikon 35mm lens, blah blah. So it was a hot and sunny morning. I didn't set up the shot properly, was just taking advantage of an opportunity. This young Kutchi woman was one of the domestic workers at a naturopathy Ayurvedic centre I visited for treatment. I love the fact that despite her low-paying job, she has a confident stance here and is taking a break, just chatting with her colleagues, cracking a joke in all her finery. Wondering if I have any tips on how to approach the editing process to improve the image. I've attached the cropped as well as the original version." So there's that notion then. I mean, different kinds of idea of portrait photography. One is where you set it up with the person knows they are being photographed, and you are creating a particular mood, feel, emotion from the lighting you use, the angles you use, and all the rest of it. The other is capture rather than creation, where you, in more documentary style, fly on the wall, you see somebody, you take the photo. Now, what's lovely about this photo, warm smile on the face. I love the way that, because she's got her kind of hand on her hip, it's creating this lovely diagonal that's coming out, and the way that the cape is sort of coming off almost like a superhero cape coming out the back. It's a kind of fun image, I think. Now, in terms of what you might have done differently, primarily, it looks like all you've really done with the editing here is to crop it. So let's open that in Photoshop. Let's close those, a couple of from Roy. And so straighten it, and then by the look of it, I think you pulled that in just to the edge of that bit there, and came into the edge of the cape there. So at that point, we have that photo, which, yeah, that's pretty much what we've got, same kind of idea. So it's cropped. Now, there's a couple of different ways you could have done this. I mean, first of all, if you'd wanted, you could have maybe cropped it with a little bit more room off to the right. So if I just, in terms of crop, we tilt it. And then if you go more that kind of slight rule of thirds bit, where she's sort of in the middle, something like this, sort of maybe make sure I've got the angles where I wanted them. Then you end up with something like that. Now, that would probably work more if you could have seen who she was talking to, and there was something else going on here. There isn't particularly there, so that's why I can see why you cropped in the way you did. However, your crop if we kind of turn that back straight there and then you pulled in here, my first thought really with this is there's all this space above her head which isn't really adding anything to it. So I'd be very tempted to just crop off part of that and maybe come a little bit closer here and come in a little bit more here. And I think as a crop, that automatically makes it a little bit more interesting. But then what's also happening here is she's kind of lost in the shadow and the background is sort of brighter than she is. So with that in mind, I think what I'd be kind of prepared, I'll open this in Camera Raw because it allows me to do various things quite quickly. If I up the exposure on this, sort of brighten this up a bit, now got to be careful that I don't sort of make her, and then I bring the highlights down a little bit so we get a little bit more detail back into the background. It allows the whole thing to brighten up while darkening down the highlights. And then if I was to say add a vignette to this as well, then you can see what that does is it starts drawing, it shades in the trees at the top and the shadow at the bottom. It doesn't look like it's heavily vignetted, but it then draws our attention more into the middle of the photo, which is the important bit. Because in the end, when we're looking at this photo, it's all about the young woman. It's not about really the background. So now if I go there, you can now see the difference between that and that. And that's just increasing exposure, taking down the highlights so the background doesn't get too overpowered, and adding a vignette. And something as simple as doing that lifts the photo. The rest of it is opportunist. As you say, it's a case of grabbing the angles as and when you see them. But you have to think about, primarily, when you are taking photographs of people, the primary object of the photograph is the person, or the primary subject is the person. Everything else in it is a support part to the person. And it's either enhancing what you're trying to say, or it's detracting from what you're trying to say. And this comes back to that notion of story, which I talk about again and again, which is what's the purpose of the photo? What's the story of the photo? And it can be any number of things, but the clearer you are on that, the easier it is to make the decisions to enhance that story. So, is she in conversation with somebody else? It enhances the story if you can see the somebody else that she's in conversation with, or you can see the shadow of the other person, or you get a stronger sense of the presence of somebody else. Is who she's interacting with an adult or a child? That would make a difference as well. Then the background's always a tricky one because you don't always have control over the background, but is the background dominating or is it supporting? So these are the kind of decisions you need to be making. But certainly when it comes to making a quick edit, fine, do the crop. You didn't need as much space at the top, but you really needed to make her brighter than the background. You didn't want the background over dominating. And then that's what we've done with those quick edits. So Asim, I hope that helps. I hope that makes sense. Right. Vijay says, beautiful stance, well-dressed girl, typical Indian broad smile as well. And Vijay likes the edit and agrees it does look like a cape. Cool, right. Okay, so last one we're going to move on to now is Russ. Russ has sent two different pictures, and I'll probably spend slightly more time on one than the other. But the main thing about this is that Russ had these pictures which he was quite pleased with, but they're not responding as well in the photo competitions and it is one of those things that we have our favourites. We have photos which we think, I'm really pleased with this. And kind of like we were joking about with Roy earlier, you put it in for critique and you're not really wanting critique. You're wanting somebody to agree that it's a really good photo. but why isn't it work? You know, you think it's a good photo, I think it's a good photo, my wife thinks it's a good photo, my mum thinks it's a good photo, but even these other photographers who I really respect say it's a good photo. So why isn't it doing very well in the photo competitions? So part of the thing that I wanted to talk about with these pictures of Russ isn't so much on the editing. There's one or two little editing things that I might talk about, but it's more about that notion of photo competitions. So first of all, let's show you the photos that we're talking about. So let me just pull up that photo. So what we've got is we have this photo and we have this photo. So I'll talk you through what Russ says. So Russ says, "Hi Kim, I thought I would submit a couple of photos for your perusal this week. They are two images I was quite pleased with, but have performed poorly on a website I know you're familiar with." So basically, I know Russ, there's a photo site out there called Guru Shots, which we both belong to. Every day it has multiple competitions going on. You can win things on it, but by and large it's really about playing a game. It's points, it's kudos. They have a team playing version where you can form a team with other people and then compete against other teams in particular themes a few times a day. Russ and I both happen to be in the same team. That's how we met. A week or two Russ joined the team I was already in. So we then get on. So he goes on. I'd be very interested in getting some objective feedback for both yourself and the group as a whole, as I know I'm biased. So Russ automatically knows that he has his own bias towards it, and it's back to this problem of, well, I think my photo is good, but then I'm kind of slightly blind to it. So what's the problem? So that becomes a problem of trying to see whether it's objectively any good or not. So the first photo was taken at a friend's stables when my dog met one of his horses for the first time. The photo was taken on so got the various bits of information about it. I don't think we need to worry too much just now on that. The second photo is the interior of my old Audi TT. The white windows were intentional, as the view outside was very distracting and took your eye away from the car's details. The photo was taken on a different camera using a wide angle lens. And you can see from the kind of distortion, and you wouldn't fit that in if you weren't using a wide angle lens. So actually, I'll deal with this one briefly first, because I thought it was a really interesting comment from VG on this in the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres Facebook group when Russ put this up, which was the notion that if this was, instead of sitting in neutral, had been put in, say, something like second gear, it would have been pulled back, and then you would have actually seen more of the top of the gear stick as well. Because the gear stick, you know, these Audi TTs, part of their appeal is in the detail. And, you know, one of the things with this picture is that gear stick sits smack bang in the middle, and you've got a bright part of the gear stick against a dark background. So it's the bit that grabs all the attention first. You see the gear stick and then you look at and you notice the rest of the car. So that's your kind of prime character. So actually, to be able to see a little bit more of the top, I think probably could be a little bit interesting. Beyond that, the whited out windows, a choice you decided to make. We've got quite dark under the steering wheel and lost in shadow here. You might have brought out a little bit more detail. You know, I mean, you've got detail in the kind of the leather or pseudo leather, certainly in the chairs and on the plastic bits around here. The kind of texture. Maybe more of that texture could have come out. Maybe you didn't need to lose it quite so much into the blacks. But then the whole picture is quite contrasty, so you've made a decision to do that. And I think that's fine. So what you've done is you've created a stylistic picture. That's the image, and people are going to like it or they're not. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about this one. I think, first of all, beautiful photo, and it's got the factor. You've got cute little dog, horse, looking at each other. There's a connection. So as well as, and I think you've also got great subtle tones. You know, we've got the whiteness of the dog, but there aren't the highlights blown. We've got the darkness of the shadow in the background, but it's not lost in the black. So beautiful editing that you've done here, Russ. Now, in terms of the image, Other things that might go against, I tend to, the only thing that strikes me about this is essentially the gap. The gap between the horse and the dog is big. Now, it isn't in reality, it's not particularly big, but in terms of the frame of the picture, it's pretty big. And one of the problems with photography is that cameras exaggerate distance. And the closer you are to something, the more exaggerated that distance becomes. So, for example, I mean, this webcam is quite wide angle. So if I sit here and I create, let's say, a gap of my fingers, so something like that. So this is about 3 inches wide. Now, from what you can see, with the edge of the picture being there and the other edge of the picture being somewhere over here, this little gap here between my fingers is taking up, oh, I don't know, 10%, maybe 5% of the picture. So the gap looks quite small. As I come closer, this gap gets bigger. As I get to here, this gap is now taking up 60% of the image. That gap, I can fit my head in it. So the same amount of space, the closer you are, the more that gets exaggerated. So if you want to have, the fingers are really close together here, if you want to have them close together here, you actually have to close them up to do the same amount of thing. Now, because you have zoomed in on the horse and the dog, that gap has become exaggerated. So there are two ways of fixing this. Either you need to be pulled further back so it's got more room to breathe about it. If you had, now this won't work in terms of reproducing. I'm using content aware fill just on this, but just to sort of give you a little sense here of space. So this is just filling in. It's going to do a terrible job where, yeah, necks are concerned and what have you. It doesn't quite look right. But if you now look at essentially the feel of this, if you look at that gap isn't as big. That gap is proportionally smaller than it was when we're here. Here it's proportionally larger. The other option, I mean, again, to show you how it might work, if I copy that, just the dog, raise them up a bit closer, like that, crop this, mask that, and I'll just paint back in the background. Now, if you do something like that, for example, now it kind of looks like it would have to you out of the camera. You know, when you were looking from a distance, they were almost noses touching, it felt. But when you took the photo, because of the way it's cropped, the gap was too big. Now that actually, although that is a complete lie and fabrication, it has the feel of what you were experiencing. So I think, Russ, that's kind of what I wanted to say about that. Is that, and that, by and large, I'm nitpicking. These are damn good photos. But I just wanted to get across that point of the gap because it's something that all of us can kind of suffer from. Now, the second thing that I really wanted to really talk about, which is the notion of the competitions. And whenever you put a photo in for a competition, who's judging it makes all the difference as to how well it's going to succeed. And if we go back to Roy's photos are going in for an Amateur Photographer of the Year competition. And for that, you're going to have proper judges. You will have people judging who are professional photographers. And professional photographers look at photos in a different way than amateur photographers, beginner photographers, and non-photographers. And if you think about that, then it makes a huge difference because I've got photos which have won prizes when judged by expert photographers, and have failed abysmally in crowd voting scenarios. Like so things like Guru Shots, Photo Crowd, Viewbug is another, and I think there's quite a few different sites online where you can you set up your portfolio, you have competitions daily, weekly, hourly, you put in your photos, and it's quite a fun thing to do. I think it's worth having a go at, even if you've never tried. You can, just set up a little account, and most of them are free to begin with, at least. Enter the competitions, because it becomes really quite interesting seeing how other people see your photos. Now, you also have to kind of allow for the fact your ego is likely to get quite bruised because of exactly this whole problem of what Russ opened this with, which is, I've got quite a good photo here, how come it's not doing very well? You have to understand that crowd voting is different to expert voting. And even within expert voting, site to site has different ideas of what they want. Lens culture is another one where a lot of status goes with that. Some very high ranking people in, well-respected judges go on that. They have a particular style that wins. Whenever they do portraits, they have what I always jokingly call with my wife, melancholic stillness. The winners are never people in action. They're never people really engaging with the camera. They're people who are sort of looking very still, maybe slightly wistful, maybe slightly melancholic. Well, it is melancholic, yeah. Sad or wounded or something. But they're very rarely looking directly into the camera, and they're very rarely doing anything. They tend to be sitting still. So if you're trying to do well in a lens culture competition, you want to go for something like that. If you're going for Sports Monthly, you don't want stillness, you want action. So the first thing to understand about competitions is what's the theme, and make sure you match the theme. But also the other thing is who's judging. Now, when you come to the things like the crowd voting, one of the really interesting things that I've discovered is there's two things that can play against you in crowd voting competitions. One is black and white. Unless it is specifically a black and white competition, colour photos nearly always do better. The second is portrait versus landscape. Unless it is specifically a portrait style competition, landscapes nearly always do better. Now, running on the back of your question with this, Russ, I went to Guru Shots this morning and I looked at the last 10 competition winners. And there's two sets of winners. There's the winners chosen by the crowd vote and the winners chosen by the guru who set that particular competition. So out of the last competition, essentially we have 20 winners. Out of those 20 winners, none were portrait in format, one was square, one was black and white. 19 were colour, 19 were in landscape format. Now, to understand that, you have to think about the way people are voting. And if they are voting with a screen, and especially if they're voting with a desktop screen rather than just off that. Let me just show you screenshots. Here's screenshots from, now this is Guru Shots, and I've just done a couple of different screenshots from my own things, right? And when you look at this, what leaps out? What leaps out immediately is colour. Here's another one. And here, what you notice is that because of the way it goes, a landscape shot is taking up more of the screen. A portrait shot isn't taking up as much. A black and white portrait shot is kind of getting lost. A landscape shot with fire flames on it grabs the attention. And so it kind of goes on. If we take a look at a shot like this, I mean, what immediately grabs all the attention is the bright orange up in the top right corner. And if I'm going in for a competition called Orange, that's a really good one to have, because it's orange and it's an orange in an orange competition. That would probably score quite highly. Subtlety, if I went in for Orange and I put in these leaves underneath, I wouldn't score anything like as well. Doesn't matter the fact that actually I think these leaves are more interesting photo than that orange. It doesn't, for people who are skimming quickly, it's less noticeable. This picture here of a couple of, I've suddenly forgotten the word, kind of like acrobats on the ribbons. Somebody will remember. Put it in the comments to let me know. Is an interesting photo if you have time to examine it. But if you are spending half a second on it as you're flipping through the images, you're not going to notice. Here's another one, where again, brightness is what's grabbing your attention. Black and white portrait is not. Let me just show you something here as well, which is what you really need to know is if people are looking at a screen with multiple pictures on. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to filter blur. Okay, let's just take this and blur it. Okay, let's blur it up to a point whereby, okay, you can see that there's sort of shapes within it, but you can't see what they are anymore. Okay, and then let's just, I've done this before for other reasons, but let's just transform, rotate 100 degrees, 180 degrees. Now, when you look at that, where you're just instantly just seeing a massive blob and colour, what's grabbing your attention? And what's grabbing your attention are this bright orangey patch here, little yellow patch here, patch of purple there. Anything that's black and white, grey, has got lost. It's not really grabbing our attention. So when we come back here, what's grabbed the attention? This pile of logs hasn't grabbed the attention. This flower, the purple flower, not too bad. The sort of brighter colours behind here, that's not too bad. But the black and white pictures haven't. This little one of the boat here, which, is actually quite, as a photo, I quite like it. There's lots of texture in the wood and all the rest of it. But in guru shots, it never gets a look in. So that's really what I wanted to try and get across to you, Russ. And to anybody else who's entering competitions, is it's not necessarily the best photo that wins. It's the photo that grabs the attention that wins. If you've got the crowd vote and people are scrolling through hundreds of these photos to vote, they're doing it at high speed, anything subtle gets missed. If you're in a competition that said red, make sure you've got something red on a red background. It's as red can be. Even if it's a black and white competition, make sure you've got a strong contrast between the lights and the darks so it grabs the attention. So it's a tricky thing that sometimes the best the photos that I get the most wins out of, or the best scoring out of, aren't necessarily the photos that I consider to be my best work. Quite often there's work which I feel is kind of slightly mediocre and isn't the stuff that I would necessarily show off to the rest of the world normally, but it can do particularly well because it's brighter, it's simpler, it's not as subtle, and so it scores better in those kind of competitions. So I hope that makes sense, Russ, and I hope that makes sense to the rest of you as well, is to understand that your photo, if you're wondering why it's doing well or it's not doing well, you've got to understand who's looking at it. And once you understand who's looking at it and how they are looking at it, so like on a screen with multiple images which they are scrolling through at high speed, then you realise that subtlety gets lost. If you are alternatively handing over an image to somebody who is going to be studying this in great detail, they're going to be looking at the technical, did you blow out the highlights, can I see the sharpness of the eyes, is there a narrative in here which is really engaging, then you've got to make sure you have all those kind of things right, So something like your horse and dog picture, lovely picture, I can imagine in something like a camera club setting would do really well. I can imagine in particular competitions where you have, judges and it's called animals and animal interactions, it would do really well. In a crowd site where it's portrait and it's black and white and it takes you more than a moment to really read what's going on, not a chance. So it doesn't surprise me that what you've got is a good photo that isn't really doing well. So hopefully then, Russ, that kind of answers that question. And for the rest of you, it kind of gives you some ideas about why photo competition, how they work. And you can use this to understand, to actually start scoring really well. It doesn't necessarily make you a great photographer, as in the way that good photographers would go, other photographers would go, wow, that's a great image. But you can score your points. So there's another thing here, which is, what are you really wanting out of your photo? If you want the thumbs up from mass voting, then be simple, be direct, be unsubtle. If you want the respect of your peers, then you need to be understanding your diagonals, understanding your technicals, understanding your balance of light and dark and shades and everything else. So anyway, thought that was interesting. Hope you found it interesting. So where are we? Do we have any more quotes? Right, so okay, VG likes the going back to the car, the steel and leather is quite powerful. Nuria saying what a difference that made. Of course, we now have 12 minutes back, so I'm not quite sure which bit you're talking about. Okay, Rosie says horse is beautiful horse, cute dog. Sandra says, I think it's a lovely image, but I was amazed that by putting the animals close together improved the image. Vici says, adorable horse and dog. After Kim edited it, it's the dog. It's like the dog can feel the warmth of the breath of the horse and is about to get a nuzzle. Rosie said, aerial acrobat. Yes, that's what I was looking for. Aerial acrobat. Thank you, Rosie. Roy says aerial silks. Yeah, it's aerial acrobat on silk. Aerial, yes. Okay, good. I feel happy now. Nuria says, that's so true, Kim. I've noticed that as well. Sometimes it makes me think how on earth some of the photos are getting in first place. Now I get it, that you've explained it. Okay, Russ says, I prefer the wider edit of the horse and dog. That's a massive improvement. I'm not so keen on cropping out the middle out, as I think you lose the sense of it being a tiny dog. But I can see your point about the effect of the lens. Okay, that's absolutely fine, Russ. I mean, it's your photo. And I think, yeah, I mean, yes, it's that difference. Once you understand that the gap is quite big, it's how you either narrow the gap or narrow the perception of the gap. And if you stand further back, the perception of the gap is narrowed. If you move in, then you can move them closer to actually physically narrow the gap. So different ways of doing it. And also the idea of the difference between professional and crowd judging is also a good point I hadn't really considered. Thanks very much to Kim and to everybody else who's put in comments and thoughts, giving him plenty to think of. That's really good. Okay, excellent. And Sandra says, useful feedback on the competition, particularly the crowd rating. And Diana says, really interesting about the competitions. Good. So, sounds like I have satisfied people tonight. So that's pretty much the end of it. If you found this interesting, do consider buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres if you would like to support the podcasts. Next week, I haven't figured out quite what I'm going to do next week. It will just be a kind of standard thing. I will either talk about a technique or I'll talk about a photo and decisions behind it, and then we will have another critique section. So if you're interested in getting feedback on your photos, put your photos into the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres Facebook group. And where you can, please try and tell me what it is you feel your sticking point is, where whether it's the lighting, whether it's the composition, whether it's the angles, whether it's the cropping, whether it's feedback you got from somebody else that doesn't make sense to you, whatever it is, if you've got a sticking point, here's the place you can do it. Put the picture in and let me know. Right, and that's it. All right, bunch of people saying good night. So I'll say good night now. See you next Tuesday. And invite your friends. Invite your friends along. So if you know anybody else you think might benefit from these podcasts, bring them along. We want to grow this community and have fun. Okay, enjoy yourselves, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Take care. Bye bye.